Now the author rahimahullah goes on to the next section of fiqh, which is tayammum. And tayammum we can generally refer to as dry ablution. It's the ablution that a person is going to do when they cannot find water, by using some type of earth like soil, sand, and it's like wiping over the hands and the face with the intention of making permissible matters like prayer. So if a person cannot find water, or they don't have the ability to use water, based on some of the exceptions that will be mentioned later on in the books, then a person is permitted to make what we call dry ablution, which is called in Arabic at-tayammum. And the origin of the permission to make tayammum is mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 6. وَإِن كُنتُمْ يعني قال الله عز وجل وَإِن كُنتُم مَرْضَى أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ أَوْ جَاءَ أحد منكم من الغائط أو لمستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا سعيدا طيبا. Yani the translation of that verse would be, if you are sick or traveling or coming from the lavatory, or having a relation, or have had relationships, sexual relation with your wives, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, and you have not found water, فَتَيَمَّمُوا, then you are ordered to make tayammum using sa'id and tayyiba, using some type of earthy substance, sa'id and tayyiba, which we'll mention during our lessons of tayammum in Akhdari. So the first thing about a tayammum is we have to know how we're going to classify the different types of people in terms of the ahkam, in terms of the rules that apply to tayammum. So in general, we're going to separate them into three types of people. First, the first person is a traveler. Then the second person, the sick. So we have the traveler, the one, then we have the sick. And then we have the third person, who's a resident and is healthy. So we have the first person, who's a traveler, the second person, who's a sick person, and the third person, who's a resident that is not sick. So the meaning of that is, if a person is a traveler, we're not concerned whether or not he's sick or not sick, because the dispensation or the rule applying to tayammum is still going to apply to him. As for the murid, the person who's murid, the sick person, here it doesn't matter if he's traveling or he's not traveling. But in terms of the resident, then we're going to distinguish. We're talking about the resident who's sahih, meaning the resident who is free from any type of sickness. So these are the three people that we're going to be concerned about in terms of tayammum. And in tayammum, the traveler and the person who is sick share the same rules. The one who stands individually is the resident who is healthy, meaning that he's not inflicted with any sickness. He stands alone. But the person who's a traveler and a person who's sick share the same rules in general. Also, add another note that in terms of the traveler, we're going to limit that traveler to a person who traveled for reasons that were not sinful. So for example, if a person travels for reasons that are sinful or that are not permissible, then we're not talking about this type of traveler. According to Al-Akhdari, we're talking about the traveler who traveled for non-sinful purposes. So Al-Akhdari mentions وَيَتَيَمَّمُ الْمُسَافِرُ فِي غَيْرِ مَعْصِيَةٍ وَالْمَرِيدُ لِفَرِيدَةٍ أَوْ نَافِلَةٍ. First thing we want to know, or the first thing that Al-Akhdari talks about, is that the traveler who's traveling for non-sinful purposes and the sick person, it is permissible for them to make tayammum for fard prayers and for nafila prayers. So we have fard prayers, and everything other than fard prayers is what we call nafila. It is permissible for them to make tayammum. And then he says, وَيَتَيَمَّمُ الْحَاضِرُ السَّحِيحُ لِلْفَرَائِدِ إِذَا خَافَ خُرُوجَ الْوَقْتِ وَلَا يَتَيَمَّمُ الْحَاضِرُ السَّحِيحُ لِنَافِلَةٍ وَلَا جُمْعَةٍ وَلَا جَنَازَةٍ إِلَّا إِذَا تَعَيَّنَتْ عَلَيْهِ الْجَنَازَةُ. Then he says, in terms of the person who is a resident and is healthy, he can make tayammum for fard prayers under a condition: if he fears that the time for the prayer is going to diminish. So for example, right now I didn't pray Asr yet, and I know that if, for example, I was sleeping and I wake up and it's close to Maghrib and I didn't pray Asr yet, and I know that if I were to go and make wudu, then it wouldn't be possible for me to catch my prayer on time. And if I were to make tayammum, then it would be possible for me to catch my prayer on time. Then a person here is obligated to make tayammum, because, as we mentioned before, it's not permissible for a person to delay purification for the sake of a person is not allowed to delay purification because of non-tahara, right? So for example, because of the fact that we have a substitute for the usage of water by making tayammum, that it's not permissible for a person to delay his prayer when he has the ability to preserve praying within the proper timing and making the substitute purification, which is tayammum. And so according to Imam Malik, preservation of the time, preserving the time, meaning to making sure that your prayer is done on time, is given preference over purification. So he says, so then that's why he says, وَيَتَيَمُّ الْحَاضِرُ السَّحِيحُ. Then the person who is a resident that is not sick, لِلْفَرَائِدِ, he can make tayammum for fard prayers, إِذَا خَافَ خُرُوجَ الْوَقْتِ, if he has strong thought that if he was to make wudu, then the time for prayer would go out. Then he says, وَلَا يَتَيَمَّمُ الْحَاضِرُ السَّحِيحُ لِنَافِلَةٍ. Also, the person who is a resident who is not sick, it's not permissible for him to make tayammum for nafila. For example, there's no water and you're a resident, you're in your home country, you're in your home state, or you're in your home neighborhood, meaning you're not a traveler, and there's no water but you want to make tayammum for nafila prayers. It's not permissible in this case, except for the person who's sick or for the person who's a traveler, as we mentioned. And then he goes on, وَلَا جُمْعَةٍ, and it is also not permissible for a person to make tayammum for the sake of Jummah. The reason why we say that it's not permissible for a person to make tayammum for the sake of Jummah is because he has a substitute for Jummah, which is Dhuhr. Because, for example, if you don't make Jummah, then you don't, if you don't make it to Jummah, then you pray your Dhuhr. So there's no excuse here for him to make tayammum for the sake of Jummah when he can just wait till after Jummah to find water and then pray his Dhuhr. The only time that is permissible for him to make tayammum for Jummah is if he's certain that he will not even find water after the prayer time of Dhuhr. If he knows that he won't be able to find water after the prayer time of Dhuhr, then it's permissible for him to make tayammum for Jummah. But the original rule is that a person does not make tayammum for the sake of Jummah, meaning under the condition that he knows that he can't, under the condition that he knows that he'll find water during the time of Dhuhr. But if he knows that he will not find it, then it's permissible for him to make tayammum for Jummah. And then he says, وَلَا جَنَازَةٍ إِلَّا إِذَا تَعَيَّنَتْ عَلَيْهِ الْجَنَازَةُ. In our madhab, praying Salatul Janazah is Fard Kifaya. What do we mean by Fard Kifaya? If one person were to pray it, then the obligation is removed from everybody else. So it is also not permissible for him to pray Salatul Janazah, because Salatul Janazah is nafila, meaning that it's not Fardul Ayn, it's not individual, it's not obligatory on every individual. So, for example, if he was traveling in the desert, for example, with a friend, or he was traveling somewhere and he happened to die, the person is his companion happened to die, then Salatul Janazah becomes obligatory on him specifically because there's nobody else to pray Janazah. And so it's obligatory at this level to make for him to pray Janazah. That's why it says wala janazah, meaning it's not permissible for him to pray Janazah illa idha ta'ayinat. Ta'ayinat means that it became wajib on him. And how does it become wajib on him? By him being the only one accessible to pray Janazah on the dead person. So another example, if there was 3 people and one person died, and one person was in the state of purity and the second person was not in the state of purity, then it's not permissible for the second person who's in for example, if let me go back. If 3 people were residents, it's important that we look at this mas'ala and we say that they're residents, and for some reason they're in a place where nobody was, and one of the people died. So there's 2 people. Still, 2 people that are present and 1 person that died. The person who's not in the state of purity is not allowed to make tayammum for the sake of janazah. Why? Because there's somebody there who is already in the state of purity, and so it's obligatory for that person to pray janazah on him. And when he prays janazah, then the obligation, fard kifaya, the communal obligation, is lifted. So that's what we mean by it's not permissible for a person to pray. It's not permissible for a person to make tayammum if that person, if a person cannot make tayammum for the sake of janazah, for the sake of praying the funeral prayer. And what we mean by janazah is the funeral prayer, except under a condition, except that praying the salatul janazah on him, the funeral prayer, becomes fard ayn, which means it becomes it becomes obligatory on that person to pray janazah on him because there's nobody else around. So that's how we separate the people in terms of tayammum into 3 categories. And we mentioned that the musafir, the traveler, and the sick go in one category, and the hadir al-sahih, the person who's a resident and is free from any type of sickness, then he's in his own category. So although we have 3 people, we only have 2 categories.